Hello there gamerinos and gamerinas. Today I'm going to show you where all the marker fragments in the Dead Space remake are hidden and take the opportunity to compare the remake to the original. Timestamps will be provided right here, as well as in the video description. So as long as YouTube keeps the chapters feature, you have a handy shortcut. Now, I'm going to assume everyone who clicked on this video knows the original game or has finished the remake at least once. I mean, why else would you want to look up the marker fragments that are unlocked by completing the game? So, there will be spoilers. And with that out of the way, let's jump right into this Dead Space marker fragment walkthrough. The first marker fragment can be found in an office near the catwalks where you need to restore power. As you can already see, the game has undergone some serious graphical overhauls. Environments spout a lot more detail both when it comes to textures and architecture or level geometry, as well as actual objects littering the floors or shelves. This breathes a lot more life into the environments. These are places where people worked and lived for months at a time. For the most part, I appreciate the added detail, though I think the developers went a bit overboard in some instances. The walls are plastered with advertisements. There were some of those in the original game, but for the most part, the design of the ship in that game was mostly utilitarian. Decoration was mostly dedicated to living quarters or personal offices. The remake looks like a mall in comparison, with posters and advertisements everywhere, or stuffed animals in the most unusual of places. As for general level design, the remake stayed very faithful to the original game without just reusing the old floor plans. The ship mostly looks the same, with a few rooms here and there added or expanded, made bigger and more complicated. Though it's not that obvious while playing. While playing the remake, I remembered many of the rooms, and only after revisiting the original I noticed how much the locations have actually been altered in the remake. And the added space isn't empty or unused, because with the bigger areas the game added more notes and recordings or just little tidbits of environmental storytelling. Right at the beginning of the game, instead of a med pack, we find this huge ass text log about Isaac's parents. It is a nice addition to the lore for longtime fans, but a bit overbearing right at the start of the game. In a scene where the rest of the team is waiting for Isaac and constantly and loudly complaining about me being not fast enough. One of the most impactful changes in the remake is that Isaac now talks.
Something on the floor here.
And this was, again, handled incredibly well. Right now the hot new trend in video games are foul-mouthed, wisecracking, constantly quipping protagonists, and a reasonable fear was that Isaac would succumb to the same fate. He didn't though. He now just contributes to the already existing conversations. He is no longer uncannily mute during moments where it's only natural and reasonable for him to talk. Instead of other people telling him how to do his job, he now gives advice or explanations.
Check! Aim for that emergency stabilizer! There! The blue light! It might slow us down!
And he randomly mumbles or curses while exploring or fighting or running out of ammo. Though now, since he has his own voice, the other characters had their behavior a bit revised, to have the new conversations flow more naturally. Hammond is now less assertive and overall more friendly, which also leads to Kendra being less confrontational than in the original game. And while I do appreciate my professional space soldiers and engineers to not be constantly at each other's throats,
Power's dead. I can't.
Then reroute the damn power.
I think Hammond got a bit too soft in the remake. He doesn't really seem like a hardened soldier or security officer.
And you're both repair techs, so how do we do this?
Isaac being able to talk alleviates a smaller issue I have with the original game. In the original, during the opening, the game tells you multiple times to cut off enemies' limbs, to efficiently kill them. It's written in blood on the wall, you hear it in an audio log, Hammond tells you again over the radio, and even your rig system mentions it to you. Why? The game had this incredibly immersive HUD system where every HUD element was part of Isaac's rig. Every hint was a pre-recorded instruction for the engineering staff of the Ishimura. Why would the ship tell him to dismember anyone? In the remake, the message in blood is still there, which is fine, but the audio log has been changed to an emergency call with a more natural flow, And now Isaac tells Hammond about his discovery in fighting the necromorphs, with Hammond even alluding to the fact that you're not actually killing the necromorphs, but just immobilizing them.
Had to shoot its fucking arms and legs off! For God's sake, send help!
Doesn't even slow them down.
Okay. The only way is hacking them apart. Those arms, their legs.
Does that even kill them? Or do they just stop moving?
The second marker fragment is on the medical deck in Dr. Kyne's office, in the secret room behind the bookshelf. And while we are on the medical deck, let's talk about a character that got a bit the short end of the stick in the original game, for how great her impact on the whole experience is. I'm of course talking about Nicole. In the original game, she followed Isaac's advice to apply for the position of Chief Medical Officer on the USG Ishimura, and after everything went to shit, she is the main motivation for Isaac to soldier through this nightmare. He wants to find and save her, which is only reasonable. He loves her and he is the reason she's even in this mess. And in the end we find out that she has been dead the whole time and Isaac either didn't know or repressed that knowledge. He was chasing a ghost created by his hopes and guilt and some marker-induced hallucinations. Thing is, we see very little of Nicole in the original game. We see a video message of her in the beginning, find a few notes, Hammond mentions her once or twice, and we have some hallucinations of her later in the game. And then it's already time for the big revelation. Now in the remake she plays a much bigger role. She now even has her own office. I guess it was always her office, but now she even has this little nameplate on the door. And we find out about what she's been doing on the Ishimura. Aside from treating the sick and injured and researching illnesses, bacteria, drug and the like, she also helped people leave the Church of Unitology, the insane doomsday cult of this universe, who kinda are on the right track. She even treated Isaac's mother before leaving for the Ishimura, not very successfully though, leading to Isaac's mother killing herself and his father, which just added a little bit more tension to Isaac's and Nicole's relationship.
Go to hell, Isaac.
Nicole!
Throughout the game we uncover Nicole's tracks, find out about what she's been doing when all this went down. She was actually pretty proactive in gathering knowledge on the necromorphs and opposing Dr. Mercer. Though in the end it was her research that allowed Mercer to complete his own horrible project. Pretty much every time when Nicole tries to help others, it goes horribly wrong. And this should have been referenced when it came to her suicide in the remake. In the original game, it seemed that everything going on was just too much for her, that she couldn't handle all the madness and death. In this game, she approaches the chaos and the horror with scientific curiosity and a whole lot of courage, so her suicide seemed a bit out of character. I guess you could always argue that the marker drove her into ending her life, but still, she was actively fighting whatever was going on there, and then she suddenly poisoned herself. Now, if she mentioned that she couldn't go on, that she made everything worse, that she hurt Isaac more than she thought was even possible, then her suicide would make more sense for this new version of her. At least I think so. In this chapter, we pick up our first weapon outside of the plasma cutter. Instead of schematics we need to bring to the store to build those weapons there, we now just find the weapons lying around, in appropriate places. Now, when I picked up the plasma cutter in the remake, I really appreciated how Isaac needed to assemble it first. It hammered home the point that Isaac is a fucking engineer. A similar thing happened in Dead Space 2, where Isaac assembled a new plasma cutter from some medical equipment. In the original Dead Space, he just found the thing on the table, ready to use. It's not bad, I just happen to prefer the way they handled this scene in the remake, which they undercut with Isaac just finding every other weapon and not needing to assemble them himself or build them at the store or whatever. And while we're at weapon assembly, the upgrade system is back, and while you still need to use power nodes to upgrade your weapons, this system got seriously revised. You still have this kind of motherboard look for each weapon, where you need to put in nodes to increase specified parameters, like damage, ammo capacity or reload speed. Or HP and air for your suit, or range, duration and the like for your stasis and kinesis modules. But where in the original game there was a lot of planning required, or at least recommended, since the board was riddled with empty spaces that still required a power node, which just felt bad. It just felt like wasting a node. There are now no empty spaces to be found. Instead, the boards are a bit more labyrinthian and don't let you access every upgrade before you find or buy the correct upgrade modules. That in turn offers special effects, like a huge ammo increase or secondary effects added to your attacks. For the most part, I like this slightly different approach. There's just one little thing that got worse in the sequel. You now don't see anymore how much an upgrade improves your stat. You only see the change after you committed to using a power node. It's not a huge issue, but, well, the original game just gave you the information up front, so why not keep it? The power nodes themselves are now exclusively used to upgrade your weapons and aren't needed anymore to open security doors. I'm torn about this. On the one hand, this mechanic added even more tension to the resource management, especially since you were never sure if the items inside a locked room were worth the price of a power node. And it kinda worked in tandem with the empty spaces in an upgrade tree. So I guess since there are no empty spaces anymore, you don't need this aspect of resource management. And well, they replaced the old system with a pretty neat one. There are now multiple different tiers of security clearance, and by finding certain access keys throughout the story and even a master key off the beaten path, you upgrade your clearance and gain access to secure rooms and containers. It might have less of a survival-y feel, but in turn it feels really good to slowly upgrade your clearance and access more and more of the ship. The third marker fragment is in the back of the engine room, the location of the dismemberment demo for the original game. This demo was a showcase exclusively for the combat system. It taught you pretty much nothing about any other mechanic in the game besides shooting enemies to pieces. So let's talk about combat. The original Dead Space released a few years after Resident Evil 4 and took more than just a little bit of inspiration from it, which isn't meant to denigrate Dead Space. RE4 was not only an amazing game, it also revolutionized third-person shooters with its over-the-shoulder camera, which brought the carnage right into your face. And the more heavy and grounded movement gave every action more impact, so you can see RE4's DNA in games like Gears of War or, well, Dead Space, which exchanged the methodic gameplay of RE4 with something more resembling an actual shooter. You can now strafe to evade attacks and also walk and shoot at the same time, though not shoot while running. So you already were a lot more mobile than Leon was in his little adventure, but movement still felt very heavy and was a bit clunky, deliberately so. The remake makes Isaac much more agile. He won't be jumping and flipping around, but he sure knows how to quickly move and sidestep attacks. So to compensate for Isaac's newfound dexterity, enemies have a much easier time in keeping up with him. Good luck shaking them off. They also don't flinch as much, or at least as consistently as in the original game, where you were able to stop an enemy in mid-charge with a body shot from the plasma cutter. But even though the enemies keep hot on your heels, they're not necessarily more dangerous. They seem to attack slower, with longer wind-ups. It's actually not that hard to avoid a slasher's slash attack, at least as long as you're not surrounded. Attack patterns in general got less challenging in the remake, even on hard. The slashers don't use their suicide charge or jump attack that often. Fragments don't burst open anymore when burned with the flamethrower. Exploders seem to give you more time to escape before they blow up their payload. And brutes are just pathetic. Maybe it's the added mobility, maybe it's the enhanced weapons, or maybe they actually lowered the difficulty, but this game is way easier than the original, and that one already wasn't that hard, if you knew what you were doing. It being easier doesn't make it less interesting though. The remake uses the upgraded kinesis system from Dead Space 2. You can now do more than just slightly inconvenience necromorphs with random crates, buckets or floppy limbs. You can now skewer necromorphs on their Brethren's blades and spikes, or even their own. You can find metal pipes and spiky little rockets to impale enemies and sometimes kill them in one hit. So keeping an eye on your surroundings and tactically using your kinesis saves you a lot of ammo. Then there is the damage layer system, or whatever it is called. This one reminded me a bit of the damage system in Dead Island. In short, enemies consist of multiple layers of flesh and tissue, kinda like ogres, or onions. And you can peel each layer off of them, one after another. Peel off the skin, peel off the muscles, peel off the last bits of flesh until only bone remains and the horribly mutilated, even more mutilated enemy crawls slowly towards you, since all the muscles needed for quick movement have been obliterated. This is so fucking disgusting and I love it. And it also adds a bit more strategy to the combat. Some of your weapons are better at destroying limbs, while others are better at peeling off enemies' flesh and armor. By cleverly combining these different attack types, you can maximize the damage you inflict and minimize the risk to yourself. Outside of combat, this chapter shows off the best use of another mechanic. In addition to the giant batteries you need to power some locked doors that you already know from the original game, you now stumble across these circuit breakers every now and then. Where the batteries were about exploration and observation, the circuit breakers are all about puzzle solving and decision making. Generally, you have to divert the available power to the systems you need to progress at the cost of other systems, like the lights, traps and defense systems, or maybe an alternate path. Sadly, this is critically underused. Most of the time you just need to power a door by turning off the lights or shutting another door. There is no actual decision making except for this one time during this chapter where you need to decide whether to shut down the lights or the life support system for this area. Killing the light makes traversing the labyrinthian catwalks as well as spotting enemies quite a lot harder, but shutting down the life support system has you running out of oxygen whenever you're in this quite large room that you need to walk through a few times during this chapter. The presence of actual consequences adds quite a bit of tension and there should have been more moments like this. The fourth marker fragment is in the break room on the 3rd floor, one of the more fitting locations. There is a perfect spot in this chapter to showcase the nifty little alive system, cleverly named but a horrible abbreviation. Depending on the situation as well as Isaac's health, he sounds differently. They recorded pretty much every line of Isaac's dialogue multiple times, for when he's calm and healthy, for when he's exhausted, and for when he's low on health. And depending on what's going on in the game, the appropriate style is chosen.
Well, the administration systems aren't doing much. We could redirect power from there.
Well, the administration systems aren't doing much. We could redirect power from there.
Certain events can also cause Isaac to breathe harder or faster, or his heart rate to go up, to get you more into his shoes. And it's handled pretty sensibly, without getting gimmicky. It really helps with the immersion. Now, this chapter housed one of the more infuriating set pieces in the original game. You had to climb up to the asteroid defense system and manually shoot incoming asteroids before the Ishimura's hull integrity dropped to 0. It wasn't the hardest minigame, but it certainly wasn't fun. So they rectified this in the remake. Now you float around in 0 gravity, and yes, I will come to that as well, soon, with multiple asteroid blasters on each side. And now you have to fly up to the cannons and perform some A-class engineering, syncing them up with your tools, or I guess your rig, to guide the cannons with your targeting system. And by that, recalibrating them until they automatically shoot any incoming asteroids. It doesn't really make more sense than in the original, but it once again highlights Isaac's ingenuity more than if he just jumped into a turret and blasted at asteroids for a minute. This game changed up a few mechanics and set pieces, for better or worse. I personally enjoyed all the changes, though I'm inclined to hold the original's 0 gravity controls in higher regard, just for their uniqueness. In the remake, it's just the straightforward system from Dead Space 2 and 3. You just float and can move in any direction. Left, right, up, down, forwards, backwards, overhead. The old system was clunky and cumbersome and didn't really complement the combat system, but it had something special. It was incredibly gamey, but well, I was playing a game, so it's alright to do something gamey. The remake system is more streamlined and accessible, but it's also less unique. To get the 5th and 6th marker fragment, we have to go back to the medical deck. One fragment is in Dr. Mercer's office, you can't really miss it. The other one is on top of the cryo chamber. And that one I did miss at first. But how do we get back to the medical deck? Of course at breakneck speed on the tram track. The tram in the original game always served as the level entry and exit. And on the loading screen the game implied you riding the tram to another part of the ship. It worked well enough, and this fractured level structure allowed for the open-ended levels without getting convoluted. But then they just connected all the areas to one another and it just worked. The ship in the remake is completely interconnected, with the tram serving as a fast travel system. Some hallways have been added, some tram stations have platforms on both sides, and it all makes just a lot of sense. The individual decks are still their own self-contained areas, but just knowing that you could reach another deck by just walking through 2 doors and a hallway makes the ship feel more real, and, at least for me, it gave the exploration even more weight. Exploring was always important and satisfying in Dead Space, and the interconnectedness of the ship just added a bit more to it. Now, in this chapter the story diverts quite a bit from the original game. It leads to the same conclusion, but a lot was added or changed. In the original, Kendra warned you about the life support system being contaminated with some weird stuff, and you need to head back to medical to brew up a poison to kill whatever is polluting the air filtration system. That's where you meet Dr. Mercer, a unitology scientist who is enamored with the necromorphs and sees them as the new dominant species that will replace humanity. He is completely devoted to this belief, so much that he sees reverence even in the atrocities committed by the Marker and its victims, and its abominations. And he welcomes it. In the remake, Isaac finds a broadcast from Nicole to gather survivors on the medical deck. So he heads there and runs into Dr. Mercer, a unitology scientist who believes the necromorphs hold the key to eternal life, and wants to harvest their power to achieve immortality. I'm not sure what I prefer more. They both kinda fit their corresponding portrayal of Dr. Mercer. One is more of a cultist, the other more of an over-ambitious scientist with no regard for ethics and morals. He was more erratic in the original game, sometimes coming off as an actual madman who talks about having a cooperative patient who you can hear begging and screaming in pain in the background.
No, the patient's resting comfortably. He trusts me, Dr. Kind. He puts his life in my hands. He knows his part in all of this.
Whereas in the remake, he has more of a devious charm who smooth talks people into compliance, who actually persuaded a patient to agree to some horrifying experiments. I guess the original game wanted to present some really memorable and eccentric characters that went a bit overboard at times, whereas the remake tries to be more gritty and realistic, with more grounded characters, whose atrocities hit even harder, but who aren't as enjoyable to watch. In both versions, he sicks the hunter on you, who can't be killed because it fully regenerates after receiving enough damage, and the rest of the necromorphs take the chance to get in on the action. You're doing a lot of frantic combat in this chapter, due to an unrelenting killing machine on your heels, quarantined rooms where you need to kill all enemies to escape, and of course, the good doctor trying to gas you to death. To defend yourself against the undead monstrosities, you get quite the arsenal. The same arsenal as in the original game, but with a few changes here and there. The backside. The plasma cutter remained mostly unchanged. It's your precision tool to cut off enemy limbs, and its special ability is to tilt to the side, to alternate between vertical and horizontal cuts. Though you can acquire special upgrades to add a burn effect to your attacks, and want to add some knockback to your melee attacks. The pulse rifle is a good panic weapon. It's not incredibly strong, but it has tons of ammo and a quick rate of fire. The alt fire for this weapon in the original was this weird 360 burst that seemed to just be there for the style and had no actual use for combat. In the remake, the alt fire is instead a handy grenade launcher. The line gun is more or less just a wider plasma cutter. I never liked this one in the original game. It lacked the precision of the plasma cutter, as well as the utility of crowd control weapons like the pulse rifle. Its alt fire were moderately powerful mines that took 3 weeks to explode. And I still don't really like to use it as a weapon in the remake. But its alt fire are those laser traps that can decimate an enemy's health bar in an instant, and invite to some experimentation. And now I show you something you can see in virtually every Dead Space review. The contact beam is another weapon I never really cared for. While it was quite powerful, it was cumbersome to use due to its charge time. Maybe it's a worthy trade-off, but it just didn't fit my playstyle. In the remake, you now have this continuous beam that burns through an enemy. It's certainly easier to use, but I still don't care much for it. The secondary fire now mimics the original game's use of that weapon, with a more powerful charged shot. The Ripper is just an awesome looking weapon. I mean, it's this huge circular saw where you can even shoot your saw blades, like your Gordon Freeman. It was an okayish weapon in the original game, but I think it wasn't powerful enough for how close you had to get to an enemy to most optimally use the thing. In the remake, this one became one of my favorites. It feels like they buffed the Ripper quite a lot. It seems to inflict more damage and has more stopping power, because I was able to slice and dice groups of enemies with just 1 or 2 saw blades. And the secondary fire can be upgraded to have the saw blades ricochet off walls, which I didn't get much use out of. Then there's the flamethrower. It burns stuff at close range and you can shoot a fireball with it. In the original you weren't able to use it in a vacuum or other areas where you weren't able to breathe. This was another mechanic that could potentially alienate players but gave the game its identity. And if you relied on the flamethrower as your only means of crowd control, then you were just shit out of luck at times. In the remake you can burn stuff whenever and wherever you want. Though with the damage layer system, this weapon becomes an incredibly useful support weapon. Burn off the enemy's armor and muscles to slow them down and then cut through them with the Ripper. This was my go-to combo. At last, there's the Force Gun. With that, you hit the enemy with charged up kinetic energy. It obliterates a family of swarmers in one shot and can send enemies flying. The old fire in the original game shot a kinetic bomb which was at times indistinguishable from a normal attack. In the remake you shoot a gravity well that sucks in any enemy in the vicinity. I guess it's a good setup for some weapon combos, though I didn't use it much. And that's the weapons list. The remake upped the versatility of the different weapons with its alternative firing modes, and I think at worst it is on par with the original game, and at best added some real utility to some of the lesser weapons from the original game. The 7th Marker Fragment floats near the ceiling in the big room where you had to fight the Brood, after you turned off the gravity. So now the game gets really disgusting, in a good way. The weird, slimy, pulsating growth was already satisfyingly sickening in the original game, but now, with the higher res textures, with greater polygon count and the overall greater graphical prowess, it's even more revolting. With recognizable body parts sticking out, like spines and skulls or whole fucking molten and decaying bodies. It looks slimy and squishy and there's lots of it in the remake. There's more in this chapter than gross slimy wall goo, though. We get to meet a completely new character. Well, not completely. Throughout both the original game and the remake you find notes and audio logs from all the different workers on the Ishimura. And sometimes those kinda tell a story of their own. 2 people you hear or read from on multiple occasions are Elizabeth Cross and Jacob Temple, a scientist and an engineer, the latter one being on a journey similar to Isaac's, right down to them being a couple and Temple searching for Cross on the ship. In the original you didn't actually meet them, they were just 2 other faceless people who died before you arrived. Well, you actually get to see how Temple dies in both games. And it's hard to say in which version he got the worst deal. In the original he was forced to watch as his significant other was brutally murdered, while in the remake he was still searching for her and got killed before he could reunite with Cross. And affected by an enhanced stasis shot, so his death was drawn out immensely. Although Temple didn't get a chance to talk to Cross one more time, Isaac actually gets in contact with her and she is alive when Isaac witnesses Temple's death. While it isn't too much, you get a bit more insight into these characters, as well as other supporting characters. This chapter ends with the first actual boss fight, one of 3 in the game. The Leviathan sits in the food storage and is the source of the ship's life support contamination. It fills up the back end of the room and attacks you with its giant tentacles. Its weak point is in its weird beak, and to force open the mouth you have to destroy its tentacles, although they regenerate after a short while. And when the mouth is open, it constantly vomits explosive chunks at you. The boss handles mostly the same in both versions, though the added 0G mobility in the remake makes it a lot easier to dodge the Leviathan's attacks. To make up for that, the remake adds a final phase to the fight where all the oxygen is drained, so there's a bit more tension there. The 8th marker fragment is in the mineral samples room, after you've gotten rid of the asteroid rocks and retrieved the level 3 access key. One major thing of note in the original game was the fantastic lighting for the time, though it is still not bad even by today's standards, mostly due to its creative and deliberate use. There seems to be not a single room in the original game where you have a static or stable light source. Lights are always either flickering or otherwise alternating in intensity. Light sources move around or get obfuscated by debris, fog or other particles. And they approach this concept in the remake remarkably. The stressful and erratic lighting is still there, but additionally, the brightness of light sources has been turned up, while shadows and unlit areas are much darker, which creates this dark contrast. When the game wants to be dark, it gets really dark. And it wants to be dark a lot. But not so much that it gets annoying or tedious. There's always a weak light source around somewhere so that you can make out your surroundings and spot useful objects, helped by your rig's HUD. And while the game, outside of a handful of deliberate combat encounters, never has you fight necromorphs in complete darkness, enemies now have a way easier time avoiding your watchful gaze and sneak up on you from the shadows. Especially the smaller enemies can sometimes be quite hard to spot, but that's not the only way enemies like to surprise you. Since enemies bursting out from vents is nothing new anymore, the necromorphs learned a new trick: pincer attacks. One enemy jumps out of a vent in front of you, wildly flailing its arms around and screaming loudly, while another one sneaks up on you from behind. They do this a few times during a playthrough, and to be honest, it gets old pretty fast. I mean, enemies can already approach you from any direction and you can never fully secure an area. And even though you are a lot more agile in the remake, this still isn't fully a shooter. So being surrounded by enemies doesn't handle particularly well. And it's somewhat ironic that the game that throws more enemies from more directions at you took away the useless 360 crowd control attacks from the original game that had you mostly fight smaller groups of enemies that rarely flanked you. With the biggest surprise enemy threw at you being them playing dead and springing into action as soon as you've gotten close. They still do that in the remake, and now that the console has a lot more RAM to work with, and items and other objects as well as enemy corpses aren't needed to despawn after 10 seconds to keep the frame rate in the double digits, you can never be sure if a room is safe or if there's a new enemy lying in wait for you in between the ones you've already taken care of. The 9th marker fragment is in the communication array chamber, where you need to rearrange the satellite dishes. This puzzle works a bit differently from the original, where you just had to put all the dishes in the outer ring. Now the dishes have connectors on two sides and we have to arrange them in the correct way to create an unbroken connection from the base of the chamber to the topmost socket. While it comes off as incredibly gamey, I guess you can see this puzzle as a representation of Isaac's ingenuity. There aren't really bright white markings on the satellite dishes. It's more so that Isaac identifies a solution to fix a problem, and his engineer brain translates this solution into obvious markings, for the player's benefit. After that puzzle we have to deal with the Leviathan again. In the original game this was another turret section, so the remake repeats the rig-guided cannon mechanic. The boss fight takes up from where the last one ended, with you in 0G without any breathable air. The Leviathan still attacks you with its giant tentacles, and now has a sweep attack covering pretty much the whole length of the area. You have to utilize 3 different cannons while the Leviathan vomits explosives at you and attacks with its tentacles and even covers the whole arena with mines. It's a lot more engaging than the original boss fight and continues to show off Isaac's talents when it comes to machinery. So now, this next chapter doesn't have a marker fragment, since you're not on the Ishimura, but instead on the Valor, a military vessel sent to retrieve the marker. Like the Ishimura, this ship got reworked quite a bit. All the major locations are still there, but moved around, slightly changed. The new Valor feels a bit more compact, some might call it intimate. The shooting range is still there, but instead of playing through 5 increasingly difficult levels, you now have to deal with a horde of enemies, which all count against your target score, so to get the high score you just have to kill all of them. Just a neat little surprise. There is another minigame in the next chapter, but that was kept pretty much intact, just updated for the new handling of the zero-G mechanics, and by that much more streamlined. The biggest diversion from the original in this chapter is how they handled the end of Hammond's story. In the original he was very proactive, always trying to be on top of things. He was the first to head into hydroponics and later the first to board the Valor, where he unlocked the doors to the engine room for Isaac, before he faced off against an enhanced brute and got killed in the process. There wasn't much story to this, it was all matter-of-factly. He was the soldier of the group, he was responsible for everyone's safety, and he did his best to rescue what remained of his team. The remake added more of a story to his character and expanded on his personality, though they changed quite a bit about his demeanor. He is now more patient and friendly and isn't really a driving force anymore. Most of the game he's hiding from the necromorphs inside the ventilation shafts, which is a problem in and of itself regarding the main method the necromorphs use to move around the ship. His story in the remake is all about Chen, one of the people who gets killed right at the start. He pretty much haunts Hammond as a necromorph, and as the story progresses and everyone slowly succumbs to the marker's influence, Hammond hallucinates Chen being still alive. In the remake, the necromorph that gets ejected in an escape pod and recovered by the Valor, which leads to its downfall, is Chen. So when we meet Hammond in the engine room of the Valor, it's not a brute that kills Hammond, but Chen has finally caught up with his former captain and attacks Hammond. In one final moment of clarity, Hammond sacrifices himself and kills Chen, giving you access to the Singularity Core. I've heard a lot of people stating that this is worse than in the original, where Hammond bravely fought a brute and you avenged him, but I never felt that way. I think this series of events is a lot more personal and it's Hammond who gets a final moment of, I guess, revenge. The problem for me was more that Hammond himself has been a bit too toned down. The more assertive Hammond would have elevated this scene a whole lot. Since the last chapter didn't feature any marker fragments, this one once again holds 2 of them. One is found in the deluxe quiet quarters after you use the circuit breaker to divert power to the doors, and the other one is in the Chief Steward's office where you met Dr. Kyne. As to the topic of Dr. Kyne, he got pretty boring with the remake. He seems like a nice guy, he's well acted and well presented, but he's just a lesser character than Kyne in the original, who was eccentric, overbearing and just a little bit more dubious. He wasn't the most trustworthy guy on the Ishimura, let's call it that. Also in the original, you can't be quite sure how he actually killed the captain. The recording has an unfortunate glitch right when the possible murder and/or accident happens. In the remake, you can see that it was an accident. He also was always helpful and encouraging and honest. Even him hallucinating his dead wife didn't hurt his depiction, it made him even more of a good and honest guy. In the original he was mumbling to himself, rambling on and on, repeating all too well-known marker head lines.
No. Don't lose hope. Don't lose hope. At first, I lost hope.
Again, they did a good job with this new Dr. Kyne. He just isn't as interesting as the original's Dr. Kyne. As for Mercer, at the end of this chapter you meet him one last time. In the original, you got a last video message of him surrendering himself to the necromorphs and getting transformed by an infector. Here, he begs the hive mind to punish Isaac and start the conversion, and then gets more or less accidentally killed when a giant tentacle grabs the marker, as if it didn't even knew he was there. So in the end, he died as his dreams and body were crushed in an instant, without glory, without purpose. And I like it a lot. And there's once again no revenge for Isaac to take. Which again, some people had an issue with, but to me, it wouldn't make sense for Isaac to go around killing people for petty revenge. All he does is defending himself against monsters out to murder him, with everything he can find. There's nothing deliberate to it. He's an engineer, not a soldier, not a hero. He just tries to get himself and his girlfriend out of this mess. So yeah, I do like this ending for Mercer's story. He was an even bigger asshole than in the original, and he died in a more pathetic way. As for Kendra, she is a lot more sympathetic. Where I would describe her as cold and ruthless in the original, here I'd call her professional. She just wants to do what she thinks is right. Her revealing that she's an EarthGov secret agent didn't come off as much as a betrayal. She investigated the CEC's illegal mining operation and tried to secure the marker so that greedy corporations or deluded cults won't cause any more tragedies like this. She is certainly misguided, but she seems to be honest about all this, and she pities Isaac and actually hopes he as well gets out of this mess alive.
You're one hell of an engineer.
So I like this version of her a lot more than the originals.
See you around. Or maybe not.
So I'm a bit split when it comes to character and story changes. Some of them are pretty good, some of them are worse than in the original, and some are just different. So I wouldn't call the remake a straight up upgrade in the story department, but instead a nice addition. The last marker fragment is in the storage area, where you need to guide the marker around the rails. After collecting the last piece, you have to head back to the crew deck and into the officers' quarters. There, in one random room, you can place all the fragments onto this makeshift altar, which triggers the alternate ending after you finish the game. So after retrieving the marker from the cargo hold and storing it on the shuttle, all that's left to do is go down to the colony and kill the hive mind. Before that, we got a minor twist on the actual twist from the original game. At this point, I was actually asking myself what had happened to the scientist from Hydroponics, Elizabeth Cross. We never heard from her again, and so far every character got an on-screen death in one form or another. Not her, because she didn't die. Instead of Isaac hallucinating Nicole being there and help him with all kinds of stuff, which kinda raised the question how some of the things had actually been done, like operating terminals out of Isaac's reach and the like. This time around, Isaac projected Nicole's likeness onto Dr. Cross, so now these instances make a little bit more sense. As for Dr. Cross herself, she saw Jacob Temple in Isaac's place. It doesn't lead to a whole new revelation, it's just a neat alternate explanation for what Isaac was experiencing, and I'm fine with it. The final boss fight was mostly okay, but got neutered a bit at the end. I guess to make it more streamlined or ease up on the frustration, but by that, losing again some of its uniqueness. At the very end of the fight, Isaac dangles head over from one of the hive mind's tentacles, which inverts his aiming controls, at least on console. It feels weird and can throw you off, maybe even lead to a cheap death, which is of course a bit of a problem. But it was such a great moment in the original game, and it's a bit sad that it's just not there in the remake, gone without a replacement. I guess decisions like that make it a better game to play, but in turn make it a lesser piece of art. But yeah, with that, the Marker Collection playthrough is done. The alternate ending is actually quite nice, and I guess it could be considered canon in the same way the normal ending is. If you want to find out about it yourself, then turn the video off now. So instead of being jump-scared by an evil Nicole illusion, Isaac now went fully insane. Talking to Nicole and even seeing her like normal, hinting at him creating a marker of his own, with mad marker-induced scribbles all over the inside of the shuttle. It doesn't perfectly lead into Dead Space 2, where Isaac is haunted by his guilt over Nicole's death. A possible Dead Space 2 remake would have to change up their relationship to fit this alternate ending, which I would appreciate, because I like the idea of Isaac surrendering willingly to the Marker's seduction more than him being afraid of it and then create a Marker while unconscious, somehow. But this concludes my little Marker Fragment collection walkthrough. I hope this helps everyone who wants to unlock the alternate ending. The Dead Space remake is a great game and one of the better remakes I've played, and it's currently wrestling with Resident Evil 1 for the title of my favorite remake. It was hard for me to put the controller down, and hunting for the Marker Fragments gave me a good excuse to play through the game again. And to be honest, I kinda want to go for another round. For everyone who stuck around, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. And of course, I wish you the greatest of days. This has been Rady and I hope to see you again on the next game.